It worked. Sorry for you folks that were waiting, but I had technical difficulties. And that's what happens sometimes with our technology. So we want to just speak about that. Somebody's phone just went off. Thanks, Larry. Oh, okay. Well, we have started now, Larry, so you can turn your game off now. We'll start with a word of prayer if we can. God, we just give you thanks for our day and this time together. We thank you for the many blessings you provide for us, and we thank you for the word that you give us, and may we use it for our own edification as well as just understanding the history of the people who came before us and all this good stuff. And so we just thank you for all you do in Christ's name. Amen. I was going to try to mention earlier that we'll probably want to do a couple of chapters tonight because I don't want us to start with Joseph. And Joseph begins in chapter 37. And we'll do about at least 2 chapters. One chapter is nothing but genealogy, if you'll notice, in chapter 36. It's the genealogy of the descendants of Esau. And we may not run through that much, so we might not be here too long this evening. We want to remind ourselves, because this is this is our week here at church. We normally are doing it. I'm at home once, and then we do it here again. So we know which ones. So we have been through Abraham, Isaac, and now we're with who? Jacob, yeah. Jacob and his brother Esau. And last week, if you did get to watch the Bible study, we talked a little bit about the reunion between Jacob and Esau. Remember, they split, didn't they? Kind of whose fault was it? Or who was the bad guy in the story? Might we say? Between Jacob and Esau and creating the friction between the brothers. Jacob was, wasn't he, Perry? Just... he kind of let mom dictate how to, what he needed to do. Because they would say that he was probably more favored by his mom. And, Isaac was really struck by his son Esau because, Esau was the tough guy. He was the hunter. He was the rugged one. And when he came in, Jacob tricked him. So he thought it was Esau, and he got the birthright, which should have gone to the firstborn son, which was Esau. It made Esau upset. And what did Esau plan? What did Esau say he was going to do when his dad died? So he's going to kill Jacob, didn't he? And who heard it? Rebekah, didn't she? And she told Jacob, "You need to get." So he ended up with Laban. He ended up marrying both of his daughters. He ended up also having a number of children, not with just Leah and Rachel, but with their two servant girls, their maids. And so right now, at this point, we only have 11 sons and at least one daughter we know of. But if you look in chapter 34, it seems like there's some other girls in here somewhere in the story. We also have just concluded the story of Jacob wrestling with God as he's told him to move on, as he's separated from Laban. And then we have this reunion between Jacob and Esau was last week, and that's where they sort of, Jacob sent these peace offerings ahead, and then when Esau came, he said, "But I don't need these things because I've got plenty." And he still took it, and then they were going to go meet somewhere, but Jacob went his own way and Esau went his. And so now we're in this the land near this plot of land. He's near the family of Hamor, who was the father of Shechem. And Shechem, I think, will become sort of a region, but it's not right now. So in chapter 34, remember that we've had all these sons. We've had Reuben and Levi and Issachar, Dan, all these. And in one of them, we had one daughter, didn't we? I think that's with Leah, was Leah's daughter. And it was Dinah. And she's in the picture here. And so all of a sudden we see in chapter 34, it says we have this story about Dinah for a little bit. And it's really not a good story. in a sense. It's kind of harsh in what happens to her, but what could happen to her in the midst of it too. So it says one day in chapter 34, one day Dinah, the daughter of Jacob and Leah, went to visit some of the young women who lived in the area. But when the local prince, Shechem, who was the son of Hamor the Hivite, saw Dinah, all of a sudden he seizes her, and it says he rapes her, which means he aggressively had his way with her, right? Without her wanting that. It kind of explains to us a little bit, that would be probably the way women were treated, was very subservient, very harshly at times. But still, what happened to her shouldn't have happened, should it? It doesn't seem like that's very appropriate, because I would suspect that to use that kind of language, even in Scripture at this immediate point, means that this was not a good thing, that it was a very hostile form of sexuality, as it is even today. But then what did he do? He rapes her, and then he falls in love with her. And of all things, not only does he falls in love with her, he tries to win her affection. He falls in love with her, doesn't he? And he's trying to woo her in some way after what he had just did. Because remember, in that time, to have sexual relations is sort of the entry point into marriage, isn't it? Is normally what marriage would be. And so this has sort of destroyed this innocence of Dinah, hasn't it? And so it may create this dilemma for Jacob and Leah in order to get her married now because of what has happened to her. So here we see Shechem has affection for her, and he shares these tender words. He said to his father Hamor, "Get this young woman, this young girl, I want to marry her." Of all things, he wants to do this. Now, in verse 4 or verse 5, it says, "Soon Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah, but since his sons were out in the fields herding his livestock, he said nothing until they returned." Because what do you think he thinks the boys are going to do? That's right, Tom. He's a little worried about the violence that might befall Shechem, right? When the boys come home and hear what has happened in this. So I'm assuming that what Jacob is trying to do is going to calm them down a little bit before anything bad can happen. They might just run off and do something. So says Hamor, Shechem's father, came to discuss the matter with Jacob. I was reading this today, and I was thinking, this is a pretty brazen group of people, isn't it? That they would, his son rapes this young woman, and he actually has the nerve to come and talk with Jacob about it. Because what does his son want to do? He wants to marry her now, doesn't he? And so Hamor comes, and he actually talks with him. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons have come from the fields, and as soon as they heard what had happened, they were shocked, and they were furious that their sister had been raped. Shechem had done a disgraceful thing against Jacob's family, something that should never be done. Yes, that was against the family, wasn't it? But here's Hamor. He's Hamor, who is here trying to negotiate with Jacob a relationship now between Dinah and Shechem. Hamor tried to speak with Jacob, it says, and his sons. "My son Shechem is truly in love with your daughter. Please let him marry her. In fact, let's arrange other marriages too. You give us your daughters for our sons, and we will give our daughters for your sons." So they're trying to develop this open relationship between the families, aren't they? Why would you think that he would want to do that? You think part of it's to save his neck? Mm-hmm. Something's trying to build into this, isn't it? I mean, Hamor really has nothing to do with this except that he's trying to negotiate for his son like a father would, right? It may also be that he realizes the wealth and everything that Jacob can offer in the midst of this if they do this. It's interesting. It talks about more daughters. It doesn't tell us how old the sons are yet, and it doesn't say if they've been married. So this would have to be something that happens post this event, wouldn't it? More than likely. It doesn't even tell us that there's any other daughters from Jacob, is it? From Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, or Zilpah, does it? It just says Dinah's the only one we know of. And so I'm not sure where all this is going to come from, because there would probably be more sons and daughters on the other end. And it says, you may live among us. The land is open to you. Settle here and trade with us and feel free to buy property in the area. So it becomes quite a bit about economics, doesn't it? In the midst of the relationship. But it still doesn't take into account the fact that some young woman's reputation has been defiled, hasn't it? That she's been treated wrongly. And it's created some tension. And it will in the midst of this family. It's one thing that Hamor comes, but do you notice what happens in verse 11? Who else comes and starts to talk to Jacob and the sons? Uh-huh. What was it Shechem did? He's the one that raped Dinah, wasn't he? You wouldn't ever see that today, would you? They wouldn't make it into the driveway, would they? But he comes and confronts, or at least is coming to talk to them to negotiate the opportunity to marry Dinah. He says, please be kind to me. Please be kind to you. And let me marry her. What do you think those brothers are doing in the midst, in their own minds right now? What are they thinking?
They're mad. They got the idea what they're going to do.
I don't know. Yeah, Tom, it's kind of like, I mean, what if it was you? What would you, I mean, you could imagine how you'd feel, wouldn't you? But here he is. He's standing there in front of them and saying, can I marry her? I think it also is hard in some ways because it does sort of exemplify what it means to be a woman in that period of time. That there doesn't seem to be some sense of repercussion that's going to happen to Shechem. That in a sense to marry her would almost be to reward him, wouldn't it? So it's a difficult chapter here, isn't it, when you think about it? And what is happening in the midst of this. He says, I will give you whatever you ask, no matter what dowry or gift you demand, I will gladly pay it. Just give me the girl as my wife. The other part of the picture is, does she want to be his wife? Well, it kind of didn't matter in a way, did it? But since Shechem had defiled their sister, Jacob's sons responded deceitfully to Shechem and his father Hamor. They said to them, we couldn't possibly allow this because, hey, look what they say. Because you're not circumcised. You're not one of us. You're not part of this group of us. Now, I think if we were to think of it in our own way, in this own day, we would think, We're not going to say that, are we? I mean, not to be cruel, but one of us might go, well, let us do it for you. And that's going to be it for him, isn't it? But they go, you're not circumcised. Remember, that was part of the covenant that God had demanded. And so it says, it would be a disgrace for our sister to marry a man like you. But here's a solution. If every man among you will be circumcised like we are, then we will give our daughters, and we will take your daughters for ourselves. We will live among you and become one people. But if you don't agree to be circumcised, we will take her and be on our way. Because if you're going to be a relationship with us, you're going to be a relationship like we are with God in the midst of this covenant we have with Him. But notice it said they did it deceitfully. I'm sure what they're thinking is these guys are not going to do this, are they? They can't really be that hip on marrying and having to get circumcised all at the same time. Hamor and his son Shechem agreed to this proposal, it says, though. Shechem, it says, wasted no time in acting on his request. And for this, he wanted Jacob's daughter desperately. Shechem was a highly respected member of his family, and he went with his father Hamor to present his proposal to the leaders at the town gate. Now, that would be a conversation to hear, wouldn't it? To go to the town gate and tell everybody, we've got to be circumcised, guys. Because that's the only way Shechem can get married to this young lady, and that we can have this kind of amicable relationship, this working relationship, this economic relationship with Jacob and his family. Because think of all the things they have. There's a lot of wealth out there in those fields with Jacob and his family, isn't it? And they want a part of it. These men are our friends, they said. Let's invite them to live here among us and trade freely. Look, the land is large enough to hold them. We can take their daughters, let me skip over here, as wives, and let them marry ours. But they will consider staying here and becoming one people with us only if all of our men are circumcised just as they are. But if we do this, all their livestock and possessions will eventually be ours. Come, let's agree to their terms and let them settle here among us. So there's some greediness even in the midst of this town people, isn't it? That's happening. Because did you hear what they said? So not only will we get to marry his daughter, but that stuff that they have will eventually be ours. Seems a little deceitfulness on both parts, isn't it? What happens in verse 24? So all the men in the town council agreed with Hamor and Shechem, and every male in the town was circumcised. But 3 days later, when their wounds were still sore, two of Jacob's sons, Simon and Levi, who were Dinah's full brothers, took their swords and entered the town without opposition. No, because the men can't do anything right now. Then they slaughtered every male there, including Hamor and his son Shechem. That was some kind of wailing, wasn't it? That they went into this town and could kill every male that's in it. But I guess it's because most of the men probably weren't gathered to city gates, where the town's gates. They were probably at home resting. And so Simeon and Levi just went in and just killed them. It doesn't tell us how many there were or anything, but we know what happened. They killed them with their swords, then took Dinah from Shechem's house and returned to their camp, which we didn't see that he had taken her already, had we? But undoubtedly he had, because she is there now. And so what they did was, not only did they kill these men, they rescued their daughter, at least what they're thinking, from this man who had already committed this evil act on her. We knew revenge was coming, didn't we? We thought it would be earlier, but it happened in this. So it says, meanwhile, the rest of Jacob's sons arrived, and finding that the men were slaughtered, they plundered the town because their sister had been defiled there. They seized all the flocks, the herds, and donkeys, everything they could lay their hands on, both inside the town and outside the fields. They looted all their wealth and plundered their houses. They also took all their little children and wives and led them away as captives. It's a pretty cruel thing still that's going on, isn't it? All because of what one man had done, that you enact this revenge upon this whole town, and also upon taking captive these women and children. Afterward, Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You've ruined me. You made me stink among all the people of this land, among the Canaanites and Perizzites." Because what they're seeing is this guy's not a fair fighter, is he? He waits till people are down and out. He waits till men are at their weakest points. He waits there at home. And then you take their women and your children too. You don't kill them, but you take them as captives. They're thinking, these guys are just not real men in some way. I like my version though when it says, "You have made me a stink among the people." That's verse 30. What does anybody else say there? It says, "You've ruined me. You made me a stink."
Odious.
A what?
Odious.
Odious?
Obnoxious.
Obnoxious?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's even a strong word for what this is, as much as stink is, in a sense. But yeah, obnoxious. What does yours say, Tom?
Stink.
Stink? Okay. Stink. It's an interesting choice of words, though, isn't it? Let's say stink. We are so few, and they will join forces and crush us. I will be ruined, and my whole household will be wiped out. But and then listen to what the son's saying. Can you kind of agree with what they've said? But why should we let them treat our sister like a prostitute? And they've kind of bought her to use her in some way, haven't they? I mean, she was already used in some way and may have got an unintentional reputation in the midst. And a reputation that we would say is not a right one to say, since she was raped. But these sons who were doing what they felt it was right in regards to what happened to their sister, right? It's an odd chapter, isn't it, in the midst of this? To have this placed in the midst of our scripture. Do you ever think about that sometimes, that we have certain scriptures, we have certain chapters, we have certain parts of the text, and we think, why is that in there? And do we think, did it really need to be? What do you think this chapter, what purpose does it serve, do you think? Does it have any reason to serve in here? And I don't think there's any right or wrong answer if you want to just blurt it out.
That just goes to show that everybody's human.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking about the sons on this part.
Mm-hmm.
I always suspect that people, especially guys with daughters, would feel it would infuriate you in a little bit, wouldn't it? The way just to have that happen in the midst of it. Because you know how you would probably react, right? Do what? Hey, Simeon and Levi didn't think it was very pretty either, did they?
It actually shows that a man stood up for a woman back in that time.
Mm-hmm.
Even though didn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, but actually their brothers.
She meant something to them, didn't she?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it was, you don't mistreat people like that. And you took away something from her that can never be gotten back, right? And you did it in a violent way. But then you had the nerve to say, I'm in love with her and I want to marry her. I would suspect that a lot of the other brothers were wanting to do the same thing, don't you? They just didn't get the chance to do it. Especially her full brothers. I think she had, 5, if I'm not mistaken? 5 brothers on that side, 5 or 6. But when you think about it, though, not just the circumstances there, does it seem like it's just one of those chapters that you wonder why it's even there? There's sometimes I think about that too. There are sometimes you wonder, why did it have to be in there? Because all of a sudden you go from this peaceful reconciliation between Jacob and Esau to this point where he's going to return back to his homeland. And right smack in the middle, you've got this just interesting, difficult, discouraging, maybe upsetting story. But doesn't it show, too, that there's an imperfection as well about even God's people at times, that things can still happen to them? That even though God is protecting and guiding and is with them all the way, things still happen, don't they? So, yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting, odd story, I think, in its placement. But there seems to be some importance that it has, especially to show that the brothers cared for their sister. Oh, we might have picked on her and fought with her, but nobody else messes with her.
And they set them other men up because they didn't know what was involved in circumcision, and then they knew they had it then.
I think that's the deceitfulness that was going on. That's why I think that.
They didn't play all the cards. They didn't show all the cards.
Yeah. That they knew how these men would feel a couple of days later, and knew that they could take advantage of that. And I wonder if that's why it says they were deceitful in their comment to in this agreement. They may have been planning something, and just Simeon and Levi got there ahead of the rest of them into doing it. So. There's a lot of deceit. Sometimes it's like a soap opera, isn't it? Things that happens. All right. Where are we? Chapter 35. Yeah. Chapter 30. Then God said to Jacob, "Get ready and move to Bethel and settle there." I don't think it's the fact that he's going, you need to get out of here. I think he has other places for him to go and be a part. Build an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob told everyone in his household, "Get rid of your pagan idols, purify yourselves, and put on clean clothing. We're now going to Bethel, where I'll build an altar to God who answered my prayers when I was in distress. He has been with me wherever I have gone." Remember, every time God would speak to him, he would always leave an altar or leave some sort of memorial with him. And so they're going to Bethel to do this. So they gave Jacob all their pagan idols and earrings, and he hurried them under the great tree near Shechem. So now this is not the gentleman we're talking about. It's just a town that's there in the midst of where they're headed. As they set out, a terror from God spread over the people in all the towns of that area, so that no one attacked Jacob's family. Which is kind of neat, isn't it? Because remember, Jacob was worried about what might happen to his family, right? the Canaanites, Perizzites, those people, if they heard what had happened to Hamor, Shechem, and all those people in that town. But here we see this sort of cloud of protection over him and his family, don't we? That will allow them to continue to move into these various places. Eventually, Jacob and his household arrived at Luz, also called Bethel, in Canaan. And Jacob built an altar there and named the place El Bethel, which means God of Bethel, because God had appeared to him there when he was fleeing from his brother Esau. Soon after this, we just hear this about Rebekah's old nurse Deborah, who she passed away. She was buried beneath the oak tree in the valley near Bethel, and ever since the tree has been called Elon Bekuth, which means oak of weeping. Now that Jacob had returned from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again at Bethel, and God blessed him, saying, "Your name is Jacob, but you will not be called Jacob any longer. From now on, your name will be Israel." So God renamed him Israel, which I thought he did it earlier, but now it's going to be more consistent, I guess, and when we hear his name. Then God said, "I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply, become a great nation, even among nations. Kings will be among your descendants, and I will give you the land I once gave to Abraham and Isaac. Yes, I will give it to you and your descendants after you." Then God went up from the place where he had spoken to Jacob. Jacob set a stone pillar to mark the place where God spoke, and he poured wine over it as an offering to God and anointed the pillar with olive oil. And Jacob named the place Bethel, which means house of God, because God had spoken to him there. It's kind of cool when they will set these little altars and memorials or places of remembrance to know that God had spoke to them or had done something great in those areas. And so here's another one of those. So quickly, we're going to see that a couple of changes here in the family. Leaving Bethel, Jacob and his clan moved on toward Ephrath, but Rachel went into labor while they were there some distance away, and her labor pains were intense. And remember, Rachel's his favorite wife, right? The one he truly loved, the one he worked 14 years to be married to. She had a son, and Rachel was about to die, but her last breath was to name the baby Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. Isn't it always cool how they name their kids and it have some sort of significance or something to it? Did any of y'all name your kids like that, thinking it could have? We didn't either. Who would have thought about that kind of stuff, right? You know. But it says that the baby's father, however, named him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem's. And Jacob set a stone memorial to Rachel's grave, and it can be seen there to this day. Jacob himself traveled and camped beyond Migdal Eder, and while he was living there, Reuben had intercourse with Bilhah. Now remember, Reuben was the oldest son, who was part. So he's not supposed to do that, is he? Because being a concubine really, in a sense, means it's kind of like a marriage, isn't it? You know, that's his. And Jacob heard about it. And then it goes. It really doesn't say anything happened to him, but it just goes and tells us the name of the sons. And then I'm going to verse 27, where it says that he returned to his father, and then we see that Isaac dies at 180 years old, and he's buried. And it's interesting that Esau and Jacob are together when they bury him. And so there's a sense of a reunion there, but it doesn't tell us, how the reaction was. But they just buried their father in that place. So, all right, that's all we're going to do tonight. I'm not going to do chapter 36 because 36 is basically just the descendants of Esau. And I don't think we really need to run through all of that. And then I want to stop because chapter 37 is going to be Joseph's dreams. Joseph's dreams. And so this is going to be, from here on, the story is going to mostly be about Joseph. And so I don't see any sense in us starting right now in that. And so we'll do that next week. So thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us. And good evening.